So welcome everybody as we continue our learning in the Ein Ya'akov, as we have with all of our shiurim, that we send our tefillot and the zuchot of our learning to the few Baruch Hashem captives who are still there and waiting for, as the chief rabbi said, Lekever Yisrael, to bring them home for a proper Jewish burial, and so the families and the parents can have a place where they can mourn. Certainly to the pitzuim, those who have been wounded on the field of battle, we send them a refuat hanefesh, refuat haguf, for the safety of all achenu b'nei Yisrael who are endangered around the world, and certainly a continued victory over Amalek, wherever they may be found. Biyachad ninatzeach. We need to maintain our unity and our focus and our tefillot and aiming our learning so that we can be victorious. So last time, we started not only a new sefer, the Ein Ya'akov, but we started a new way of learning. One where we are tasked at uncovering the spiritual secrets that Chazal has hidden in the stories and histories and sayings that they give us. And we brought a story last time about Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Chia bar Abba, both who were accomplished Rebbeim, one in the field of aggaditah, in the field of this non-halachic learning, and the other in the field of halacha. And they both showed up to a city to give public shiurim, and Rabbi Abahu's aggaditah shiur was standing room only, and Rav Chia's halacha shiur, well, let's say be kind and says was not. And if you recall, Rav Chia was disappointed in the turnout, and Rav Abahu told him not to be upset for reasons we discussed last time, that aggaditah has a greater mass appeal. One reason that we suggested, that he said it is like daily wares, where these are spiritual and ethical sustenance that people need every day, right? How to have faith, how to treat each other, finding meaning in suffering, a way to connect to the Kadosh Baruch Hu in a very personal way. I'd like to offer another idea as to the appeal of aggaditah, and that is that aggaditah exists on many different layers, and every individual can find meaning regardless of where they are in their learning or their relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So they tell a wonderful story about the Vilna Gaon, right? The Gaon from Vilna. He was learning Chumash with his grandson, and they were studying the Dor HaFlaga. They were studying the story of the Migdal Bavel. And the Gra's grandson looks at his grandfather and says, Zaidi, do you understand this story? And the little Nagon thought about it, and he said to his grandson, no, I don't understand this story. Now, the reality is, what the boy didn't understand and what the Gra didn't understand were eons apart. Right? But still they could understand, or in this case not understand, the story on their own level. So last week we began to looking at the first Mishnah in the Gemara, in Masechet Berachot, which is dealing with the time to say Shema in the evening. Now, while it is largely a halachic discussion, and it was not part of the original Ein Ya'akov, as Yaakov ibn Chaviv put it in, there are a couple of aggadic sections to learn. So just as a reminder, the Mishnah began telling us that the time to say Shema in the evening is the same time that the Kohanim become tahor after going to mikvah and can, as a result, eat truma or eat kodshim. So let's look at source 1. It says, Michti kohamim emat ka achli truma. So let's see now, when do the priests enter to partake in their truma? And it says from the time of the emergence of the stars. That means 3 medium-sized stars that you can see in the sky clumped together. And they ask the question, if this is the case, then let's the Tana teach that the time for the recitation of the Shema is the time for the emergence of the stars, right? Why does he have to go into this whole idea of the Kohanim? And it says, to teach us a matter in passing, when do the priests partake in their truma? From the time of the emergence of the stars. So, what they're trying to teach us is this. At the time that these were being put together and taught, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, and it was already about 80 years afterwards. And people were beginning to forget what life was like. There was a tremendous amount of hope, as there is today, that the Beit HaMikdash would be rebuilt. So they took every opportunity to remind people in terms of what happened and how things operated when the Beit HaMikdash was still in business, so to speak. Because at this point, whereas living in Eretz Yisrael, you still needed to separate Truma and Maasros, like we do today on a D'Rabbanan level. You couldn't give it to a Kohen for a whole bunch of reasons. One is you couldn't really become Tahor. The Gemara tells us that later on, that at this point they said everybody in all Jews in the world really are Tamei Meit. Everybody has gone to a cemetery. Everybody has gone to a funeral. And there's no way, since we don't have the Para Aduma, we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, to become really Tahor. And one of the passions of Rabban Gamliel, right, and the yeshiva at Yavne was to preserve as much as possible in the memories of the people, or at least in the memories of the Rabbanan, the practices of the Beit HaMikdash. And this happens all the time, right? So I will tell you, according to the Torah, this is just an example, we only need to bring lulav and etrog on day one. That's it. In the Beit HaMikdash, they took it all 7 days. So the Rabbanim says, we're going to do that too, so that we remind ourselves that when the Beit HaMikdash is built, everybody is going to take it for 1 day, and in the Beit HaMikdash, we will restore that practice. Okay. So the details of this Mishnah are less important to us than the message, right? Truma at the end of the Beit HaMikdash needs to be preserved, the idea needs to be preserved, and it needs to be front of mind. So, to go back to the Mishnah, eating Truma, depending on what happened to make him no longer Tahor, the Kohen had to go to mikvah, right? Because there are lots of different things that would make an individual not Tahor or not appropriate to eat Truma or Kachim. But in certain cases, he also needs to bring a korban. He needs to bring a sacrifice. And since in this this period of time in history he could not, this also gave the Rabbanim who are teaching these classes to say, you will remember that in the Beit HaMikdash, if a Kohen or anybody else had experienced a certain kind of tumah, they would need to bring a korban, right? So these were kind of cliff notes to allow Rabbanim to reinforce into the students this idea. Going on to source B, it says, Mimai daha uba hashemesh beviat hashemesh v'ha v'taher taher yoma. Okay, so the Gemara is going to have a problem when they say that ba hashemesh, when the sun comes. That's what those words mean. And it says when the sun comes and the Kohen becomes Tahor. Okay, so when is that? We know, or we think we know at this point, that means at night, when the sun sets. But you could also use those words to say when the sun comes means when the sun rises. And the Gemara is going to go into, and we're not going to spend time on this because it's a halachic discussion, which is it and how can we prove it, right? Which is very, very apropos to how the Gemara learns. Now, the yeshivot in Bavel, in order to prove it, they bring folk saying. It says here that we're going to prove that it means at night. The Amrit Inchi, as people colloquially in Bavel says, I'arev Shimsha, when the sun sets, the Idaki Yoma, and the day becomes purified. And they say because we use the word V'idaki, which in other places means it's purified, we can prove that what they're talking about is nighttime. Now, I had promised you in the beginning that this year is not here to focus on halachic debates, but on an aggaditah. And so far, I know I have broken that promise. Let me offer you an idea. Right? It says that he brings a proverb. And then in most of the explanations, people just skip over what that proverb is. And it's a weird proverb. Right? Outside of the context of the particulars of this debate, the Ramchal, who is Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who wrote an introduction to aggaditah, which is printed in most editions of the Ein Ya'akov, writes the following. This is source 3. The third method, he's talking about different ways to approach learning aggaditah, is the method of simple sayings, kalut, that the rabbis will often bring sayings like this, and it means that an important and lofty idea is hinted at through words that may seem at first glance simple or unimportant, like the sayings of ordinary people. Yet those sayings actually point to deep and elevated matters. For someone who understands these hints and knows how to think about the surface, they serve as clues leading the mind from what is obvious to what is hidden, and from what is lowly to what is exalted. And then he brings an example of a pitgam, a proverb, a saying. So what the Ramchal seems to be saying, that if I may be allowed to use a common proverb, don't judge a book by its cover. When Chazal chooses a simple folk saying, they do it with a purpose, and if one skips over it, they do it at their peril. Now, we look at this, and most of the time it is just looked at as proving a halachic point with no importance in and of itself. But the Ramchal is telling us that there is a deeper meaning here that is hiding in plain sight. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what exactly does this proverb mean? So let me read it again for you. And it is, the sun has set and the day is purified. Now, I will tell you that I tried to find commentators who explore this proverb, right, as a proverb itself, and what it reveals about a worldview of Jewish farmers and laborers in Talmudic times, but I was unsuccessful, right? So the classical commentators like Rashi, the Maharsha, the Eitz Yosef, they all explain this as it applies to the halachic debate that is going on. And they pass right over the fact that the Gemara is on purpose bringing folk wisdom, which according to the Ramchal has a much, much deeper meaning. So that opens the door for suggestions that I want to offer. So one, when it says, the sun sets and the day is purified, it's a way of people saying TGIF. Thank God it's Friday. Thank God that the day is over. So imagine a laborer in the date groves of the wheat fields of Sura or Pompadita, and he's been plowing and threshing or harvesting from dawn, right? He's covered with dust and chaff and mud and sweat, and the work is endless. Finally, the sun dips below the horizon, and at that moment, he says, right, this day is over, and I can be purified. That's one idea I had. There's a deeper meaning, I think, here too, because he doesn't say the day is over, he says the day is purified, right? And is only purified at nightfall. So the question is, there is an idea here, because Yom typically represents this world, and Laila can represent the next world, Olam Haba, and thus the purification of the day is not just its end, but it's a transition from the state of spiritual impurity, where we are distracted by what goes on in this world, to the state of purity, right, in Olam Haba, getting close to the Kodesh Baruch Hu. So in this way, the rabbis weren't just using a random phrase, that they heard this folk saying, that in it had a profound theological truth and perfectly mirrored this legal principle. So the common man felt in his bones that true purification came at night, not at dawn, and he experienced it as the liberation from toil. And this aligns perfectly with the subject of the Gemara, which is the transition when one can become ritually pure and engage in holy acts and eat truma. The Gemara goes on to say, in the West, meaning in the yeshivot, in the yeshivot of Eretz Yisrael, they said they never heard of this saying. So it can mean one of two things. Either they never heard of this saying, which is possible, or more likely they never heard it as used as a proof for a halachic idea. Let's move on to the next piece, where it says, Hai uva hashemet biat shimshohu umay v'taher. So they raise the dilemma. Does the expression after the sun sets refer to the actual setting of the sun, and it is the purified means that the day clears away? Or perhaps it refers to the setting of its light at sunset. Or it is Tzeta Kochavim. Ultimately, they resolved this issue. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that kind of bilbil. So once done, we have an argument at the time that the Kohanim could eat their truma, and turn the time, and in turn, the time we can start saying Shema is Tzeta Kochavim. We then have a statement that comes out of the blue. This is source 5. Da'amar Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says, Bein hashmashot keheref ayin, ze nechnas v'ze yotzei, v'i efshar la'amod alav. We have a time that is called Bein hashmashot, which means between the suns. Erev, in Hebrew, means a mixture, where we don't really know whether it's day or whether it's night. Right? I mean, and how do we treat it? And it's a massive halachic problem that continues really throughout Shas. And it has to do with when you can light Shabbos candles and when Shabbos is over, etc. And Rabbi Yosef's opinion here is actually one of the several and is quite controversial. But the question, what he is saying is that it is beheref ayin. Beheref ayin literally means a blink of an eye. So think about it as the time it takes to flip a switch. Picture your Shabbos clock, the time when it goes from off to on. That's the time of Bein Hashmashot, according to Rav Yosef. There's a deeper understanding that's here, right? He's not just talking about a halachic issue. The commentary Haboneh on the Ein Ya'akov, which is Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leon, who lived in Italy in the 16th century, he says that this idea is much more important than just to determine halachically when nightfall is. And he cites a medrash from the first parak in Berachot. It says, Amar Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Basar Badam she'eno yodea lo itav velo rega'av velo sha'atav. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, a mortal human being who does not know his times, his minutes, or his hours, he must add from the profane to the sacred. Meaning that we don't know when exact moments are. We can't determine this. So we have to add a siyag. We have to light candles for Shabbos earlier because we're not sure exactly when that minute is. But, he says, Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shehu yodea rega'av, that he can determine the times and the minutes and the hours, nichnas bo kechut hase'ara, that he can determine time down to the width of a hair. So think about it. On the seventh day, God rested, but he didn't stop time. He slipped into Shabbat at the exact femtosecond. Do you know what a femtosecond is? Yeah. It's a billionth of a second. I had to look that up. I know you all know that I had to look it up. It is the smallest time that we can determine. So he had to create and understand that exact femtosecond, the day 6 ended, and Shabbat began. No overlap, no gap, precision. And to put it in this context, right, by the time it took me to explain this, 1 trillion femtoseconds have gone by. Yes, Naftali?
Nothing.
Okay. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's point in the Midrash is like our Mishnah, that we need to add a siyag to our determination of nightfall in order not to make any mistakes since the time is short. But Rabbi Leon tells us that we should marvel and appreciate God's greatness and his ability to calculate this femtosecond of time. Not only should we pause now to reflect on this, but we do this every day. We say, according to the Haboneh, v'chein omrim, and this is why we say in the tefillah of Arvit, umavir yom umevi laila, he passes the day and he brings the night. Hashem tziva'ot shemo. That only the Kadosh Baruch Hu has the power and the ability to determine exactly when night is. So when we daven Marav and we say these words, that's what we're saying. That we're marveling at his ability to create a world where only he has that kind of precision to understand the division between day and night. Every night when we say Umavir Yom Umevi Laila, we're not just describing sunset. We are witnessing God's femtosecond switch. The same one he flipped in his cosmic timer on day 7, he flips it for us every evening. Right? That's not just poetry, that's physics with a bracha. Now, we're going to go into a discussion about timekeeping in the days of the Mishnah. It is based on the division of night into something that is called watches. Okay, so quickly it becomes clear that this discussion is going to operate on multiple levels of understanding. First, we're going to have a halachic debate in terms of how long we can say Shema, but we can and should read it symbolically and also metaphysically. Okay? And there's another layer where we can look at it ethically and spiritually. Let me tell you how this works. So in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer told us that it was his opinion that you could say the Shema until the end of the first watch. Right? If you remember Rabban Gamliel and the Chachamim, they both agreed you could say it until daybreak. The Chachamim said, we want you to stop at Chatzot and midnight so that you don't fall asleep or you don't forget. Okay? So Rabbi Eliezer has this idea at the end of the first watch. Now, we had spoken last time in terms of how we calculate time. We believe that day and night have 12 equal hours. And what you do is you take nighttime, you divide it by 12, and each one of those is an equal hour of night. Then you take daylight, and you divide that into 12s, and you have equal hours of daylight. Now, what you don't have is you don't have equal hours during the day and night. Okay? Those are called sha'ot zmaniyot. So just as the Mishnah earlier grounds halachic time in the Kohanim purification, a symbolic rather than a purely astronomical marker, so too Rebbe Eliezer uses watches, not merely as units of time, but as a window into spiritual structure. Now, these watches are military watches. It is the changing of the guard at night. And the Gemara is going to ask a question, how many watches are there during a night? And it makes a difference. If there are 3 watches, then you can say Shema for 4 hours. If there are 4 watches, then you can say Shema for 3 watches. So now you're going to ask the question, why is there even a question in terms of how many watches there would be in Israel? And that's because there were 2 models in play. There was the Greek model, which lasted for 3 hours, and there were 3 watches a night, and then there was the Roman model, which had 4 watches during the night. And they wanted to know which one was Rabbi Eliezer referring to. And he uses psukim in the Torah to prove which of these are going to be supported, right? And in the end, he says that there are 3 watches during the night. But Rebbe Eliezer is not just being cryptic about time, he is using this as a way to teach us something about the cosmic structure and our relationship to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. He gives us the descriptions of the different watches in terms of what happens in heaven during that time, and we will need to unpack them. But first, he tells us something that we really need to think about. He tells us that heaven and earth, meaning the realm of the Kadosh Baruch Hu and the realm of man, meaning here on earth, are parallel in structure and behavior and midot. So let me give you some famous examples that you will instantly recognize. In terms of structure, on Yom HaKippurim, at Kol Nidre, we begin by saying, B'yeshiva shel mala, u'b'yeshiva shel mata, al dat hamakom v'al dat hakahal, anu matirim litpalel im avaryanim. You've all heard that before, right? What does that mean? B'yeshiva shel mala, in the heavenly court, u'b'yeshiva shel mata, and in the earthly court, which means in some way, in these parallel structures, there is a court in heaven, and there is a court on earth, and the court on earth parallels what's happening in heaven. And even practices, in terms of what we do here on earth and what we do in heaven as well, are parallel. For example, in Masechet Berachot, which we will get to in not too distant future, tells us that the Kadosh Baruch Hu wears tefillin like we wear tefillin, right? They're different from the ones we wear, but he also wears tefillin. What that means exactly, we'll get to it. It says, Amar Rabbi Avin bar Rav Ada, so Rabbi Avin ben Rav Ada said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, from where is it derived that the Holy One, blessed be He, wears tefillin? as it's stated, and the Lord as he brings a pasuk from Yeshaya. So we have this sense that as the Kadosh Baruch Hu behaves, we behave in a parallel way. And even midot, even the way we should behave, are parallel. So there is a sefer that I've referred to a couple times called the Tomer Dvorah. It means the Dvorah's tree, Dvorah's palm tree, and it is written by the Ramach, this Rabbi Moshe Cordovaro, who was the teacher of the Arizal, who was teacher of the Arizal, who we know as the founder of Kabbalah. And he says that there are two sets of Midot HaRachamim, right? The Kadosh Baruch Hu gave us one, and we repeat that either on Rosh Hashanah, either on Yom Kippur and fast days, or in some communities every day. And we're familiar with that. That's the Hashem, Kel Rachum V'Chanun Erech Apayim B'Rav Chesed V'Emet. The Ramach says that there is a parallel Yud Gimel Midot that applies to the upper realm, and that's a quote from the Navi Micha. So let me read it, and you can tell me when we say this. Mi el kamocha nosei avon v'over al pesha l'sheirit nachalato lo hechezik la'ad apo ki chafetz chesed hu yashuv rachamehu yichbeshu avonotenu v'tashlich bimsolot yam kol chatotam titen emet liYa'akov chesed liAvraham asher nishpat alavotenu mimei kedem. When do we say this? Okay, so let me read it in English and key in on one of the words, one of the phrases. Who is like you, God, forgiving iniquity and remitting transgression, not staying angry forever, towards the remnant of your people, because your loving graciousness, God will take us back in love, quashing our iniquities. You will hurl our sins into the depths of the sea. You will keep faith with Yaakov, loyalty with Avraham, as you promised an oath to our fathers in days gone by. Pardon? No, we say it on Rosh Hashanah. We say that tashlich. We probably say it in tashlich because of v'tashlich bimsolot yam kol chatotam. You will send all our sins into the sea, right? And this is the cornerstone of tashlich. And the Ramach says that these are the behaviors of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And he parses these out and gives lengthy explanations, and he uses it to say, like Kadosh Baruch Hu behaves this way, we need to behave this way. And maybe we'll save that for another time. But for here, we have another idea that there is a parallel between what goes on in Shemayim and what happens here today. And this is by design. The Kadosh Baruch Hu made it this way. Again, near the end of Masechet Berachot, that we will get to, not immediately. Amar lehu, hachi ke'amena, berich rachmona diyahev malchuta ba'ara ke'ein malchuta derakia. Blessed is the merciful one, Kadosh Baruch Hu, who grants kingdom on earth that is a microcosm of the kingdom in heaven. So he designed this world. Now, in that sugya, they're talking about kings, right? But he's saying that just like God has kings, we have the institution of kings, and that institution doesn't always, reflect how a king should be, the Melech Malchei Hamlachim. And the Medrash specifically tells us in Shmot Rabbah, Ki kol b'shamayim u'ba'aretz, they're talking about something else there. Atam motzei kol ma shebara Kadosh Baruch Hu lemalin bara lematan, which says whatever the Kadosh Baruch Hu created above in Shemayim, he created a reflection of that here on earth. So the $64,000 question is why? Why is this parallel a reality? Why is this parallel necessary? So there are 4 ideas that I'd like to offer. One idea is, if you borrow the Ramach, Tomer Devorah, is the Kodesh Baruch Hu wants us to behave in our world like he does in his, right? In the case of the Gemara citation, just like when he's talking about kings and judges, just like the Kodesh Baruch Hu judges with Rachamim, so too he wants our leaders and our judges to rule with Rachamim, which is really the net message of the Tomer Dvorah. Second idea that's related is just as the Kodesh Baruch Hu is concerned with everybody in terms of dispensing justice, in terms of all of his creatures, we too should be dispensing justice and ruling justice equally for everybody. There's a third layer, if we want to go a little deeper, and that's more of a Kabbalistic and Hasidic idea, is when we say that the upper realms and the lower realms are parallel, that isn't exactly true, because they are connected, and they're really one. So the Kabbalah talks about this concept called tzimtzum, which is, it tries to solve the problem. If God is everywhere, and God takes up all space, so to speak, then how do we have room for us? And there's an idea that God retracts himself, makes himself smaller to create space for us. Now, whatever the precise meaning of this is, it says that we are in God's space and we are bound to him through like an umbilical cord, right? That we are separate but connected. And biblically, we have this idea that we'll read in a few weeks of the sulam, of the ladder of Yaakov when he was in Bethel, that connects the sky and the earth. That this idea is that it's not a parallel relationship, we are connected. So the fourth idea is very different and is worth considering, and that they're not parallel realities between Shemayim and Aretz, but the key word that we need to think about is that they're called mishmarot. They're called watches. And we know that night is a time of both physical and spiritual dangers. And we say this in many different ways, in many different places. In Tehillim, I brought 3 psukim from different Tehillim. It says, Ki rega apo chayim beritzono, be'erev yalin bechi u'beboker rina. For he is angry but for a moment, and when he is pleased there is life. One may lie down weeping at nightfall, meaning nighttime is the time of crying, but at dawn there are shouts of joy. We also say lo tirami pachat laila. We shouldn't be afraid of the fear at night. And then we say every Shabbat, Tov lahadot laHashem u'lezamir l'simcha elyon. It is good to give thanks to God and to sing his praises. Lehagid baboker chastecha, to say in the morning his grace, his chesed, ve'emunatcha b'leilot, and the belief in the Kodesh Baruch Hu at night. Because at night is the time where you need emunah. The night is the time when you can't and sometimes don't feel the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and that's the time you need to strengthen your beliefs. There is something called Tikkun Leil Chatzot, which is prayers that are said in the middle of the night, beseeching God for his protection. Now, part of it is that we believe that nighttime is the best time, or at least Chatzot is the best time for us to pray and to be heard by the Kodesh Baruch Hu. It might be because our world is silent, right? And we have time to think and reflect. We do this once a year, right? Slichot are supposed to be said at Chatzot. Now, we do it in the morning, or we do it a little bit earlier in the evening, and it's all halachically permitted. But the idea is we should take advantage of the time when we reach out to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, because it is the scariest time at night. And what Rabbi Eliezer is telling us, according to this idea, is just like we have military watches to protect us from physical harm here on earth, the Kadosh Baruch Hu is also on watch during the nighttime in Rakia, in heaven, to save us from spiritual harm. We say, Hine lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. God neither slumbers nor sleeps. He is the protector of Israel. And we have the word Shmirah. God is always on Shmirah at night. And so Rabbi Eliezer transforms this military timekeeping to teach us and to tell us of theology, right? That God is standing guard over a vulnerable world, which is a beautiful idea. Yeah, Ruth.
What you're saying reminded me of, I don't know which hostage it was, and I don't think his experience is true for all the hostages. But he spoke that this hostage of being in the darkness and this phenomenal closeness to Hashem. He got so close, and it's the one thing he now misses. Now he is out of there. He doesn't want to be back in there.
No, I get it.
But he can't reach that closeness now. The silence. Sure.
That's a very powerful image. Right? So in the middle of his trauma, that's when the Kadosh Baruch Hu was closest. There's a poem that is used by lots of different religions called Footsteps. Right? Are you familiar with that poem? Maybe I'll bring it next time. But the gist of the poem is that an individual sees four footsteps, or two sets of steps, one him and one the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And in the hardest time of his life, he looks back and he sees two sets two feet. And he says to God, how could you have abandoned me? And he says, I'm the one who carried you. Right? So that's that image, that in the darkness, that's when the Kadosh Baruch Hu was closest.
What happens with any kind of trauma, particularly when one loses a loved one, often you feel very close to Hashem then, and it doesn't last. When you get out of that trauma, that closeness disappears.
Because it's not needed. I guess it's always needed, but yeah, I mean that is absolutely true, and that is Rabbi Eliezer's point. And what he says, and we'll see it not this time, but next time, although we might read it, is he said that during this time, right, this first watch, that God roars like a lion. And learning Shema within these hours means, if you think about it, that this is the time of where we become closest to Hashem, and that he watches over us. I didn't bring it. Maybe I should have, but there's a wonderful idea. The question becomes, why do we have to say Shema twice? Why do you have to say it in the morning and at night? Right? I mean, yes, sir.
Well, I learned a while ago, the reason we say Shema at night before we go to sleep is because it's to prevent us from having bad dreams.
Okay. So I think that's right. I mean, there's an idea that putting yourself in God's hands, certainly at night, to protect us. And
we don't have any bad dreams while we're sleeping.
Yeah, correct. And the experience of Shema is different. at night and during the day, because our lives are different. The other thing that I came across that I thought was really interesting to think about is something that one of my Rebbeim had said. He said, inspiration is like showers. You need to take them every now and again. So the inspiration of the Shema that we say in the morning wears off by the time we're at night. And we need to be inspired in a different way at night. And it's a wonderful idea, because it says when we read Shema, we should be inspired, right? We should use that opportunity to connect to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to help us through the day, and at night to connect to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to help us through all the travails of the night. So we began this year saying that we have undertaken not only a new sefer, but a new way of learning. One, we are tasked with uncovering the spiritual secrets that Chazal has hidden in stories, histories, and sayings. So the Gemara here has begun with a simple halachic question, which is, when can we begin and end the recitation of Shema in the evening? And the reality is, it's a very short halachic answer, which is from the time you see 3 medium stars clustered together until midnight. But along the way, we discovered that this almost trivial technical question unlocks a universe. It connected us to the Kohanim and the Beit HaMikdash. It revealed to us God's femtosecond precise management of time. And most profoundly, it says that through Rabbi Eliezer's watches, it shows us that our night, with its vulnerabilities and its prayers, is not a void. It's a time when divine and the human realms are aligned in this kind of cosmic dance of protection and connection. When we say the Shema tonight at the right time, we are not just fulfilling a halacha, which obviously we are constantly stepping into the sacred parallel structure and aligning our voice with the heavenly watch who is over us. So I think I'm going to stop there.